Okay, everybody, why don't we get a start? And as people join the waiting room, we'll let them in. I'd like to welcome everybody to this very exciting webinar. The topic is EDI, Two-Eyed Seeing, and Strengths-Based Indigenous Patient-Oriented Research. This is a summary of the overall objectives, and I'd like to just go through the media disclosure. The presenter portion of the workshop will be recorded. The recording may be shared, published, and or repurposed for other educational purposes. The discussion portion of this workshop will not be recorded. Images, screen captures of the workshop may be taken and displayed on official ABSPRU channels for engagement and or promotional purposes. You're welcome to leave your camera on throughout the webinar. However, if you don't wish to appear in these images, please ensure that your video camera is off. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. As I mentioned, you're welcome to keep your webcam on during this session, and we do encourage that. But please keep your mics muted unless you're called upon to ask a question. Feel free to use the chat box throughout the session to post questions, and we'll have a question and answer period at the end of the session. During that Q&A phase, please use the raise hand tool if you would like to be unmuted to ask questions, and we'll also circle back to the chat room to get to the questions that you post through the session. This space is a safe space for discussion. It's a space where you can feel comfortable to express honest opinions and impressions, thoughts, attitudes without fear. A safe space can be as small between two people or can be expanded to include all of the members of a large group. Rules of discussion, please assume positive intent. We're all doing our best to the best of our abilities with the knowledge that we have. We recognize and value the experiences, abilities, and knowledge each of us brings to the discussion. Please practice active listening to understand, not to respond, and please feel free to ask clarifying questions. Please avoid interruptions and pause and think through comments before making them. Challenge ideas, not people. And of course, never demean or embarrass a person, and be open to being challenged or confronted on your ideas or prejudices. We have a pre and post survey, which I will post in the link in the chat in a moment. And if you have a chance, as we're going through the first part of the session, please take a few moments to fill out the pre-survey, and the link will be emailed to you after the session to fill out the post survey. And I'd like to introduce my team. I'll start with myself as I'm the one speaking. My name is Kelly Buckrice. I'm the Associate Director of the Alberta SPOR Support Unit Capacity Development Team, and I'm so pleased to welcome all of you here today. I'm really pleased to have our lead, Dr. Sophia Ahmed, with us today as well. And I'd like to acknowledge Diane Christensen, who is our program coordinator, who has been the one to put all of this together for what we anticipate will be a really exciting and vibrant webinar today. And I am so very pleased to welcome and introduce our wonderful moderator, Mary Bocage, who is the Indigenous Peoples Engagement and Research Council with the Council CKD Network. A little bit about Mary. She is Anishinaabe from Nipissing First Nation outside of North Bay, Ontario. Mary has type 2 diabetes and developed end-stage kidney disease in 2013, for which she received dialysis. In March of 2015, Mary received a kidney from her cousin. Mary co-chairs several provincial and national patient councils, including the Ontario Renal Network's Patient and Family Advisory Council, and the Council of CKD Network's Patient Governance Circle and Indigenous Peoples Engagement Research Council. She has been a keynote speaker, panel member, and presenter at provincial, national, and international nephrology conferences, and she brings a wealth of knowledge, enthusiasm, and passion to her work. So with that, welcome, Mary, and I will turn it over to you. I will mute myself, but I'll turn to this slide and turn it over to you for the land acknowledgement, Mary.
Anin Kenawea, Tansi. Hello, everyone. Mary Bokaj Nishtakaz, Nishnava Kwayandao, Nabising Robinson Huron Treaty Dunjaba. My name is Mary Bokaj. I'm Anishinaabe from Nipissing First Nation in Robinson Huron Treaty Territory in Northeastern Ontario. This is part of the territory my ancestors worked, lived, and played on, and I'm honored to call it my home. This area is a long established crossroads for all directions, coming to trade and participate in ceremony. I want to share my appreciation and respect to the elders in my community, past, present, and emerging. The University of Alberta and the University of Calgary are located on the territories of the people of Treaty 6, the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, and Nakota Sioux, and the Métis Settlement and Métis Nation of Alberta, Regions 2, 3, and 4, as well as Treaty 7, Blackfoot Confederacy, as well as the Tsuut'ina Nation and Stoney Nakoda First Nation, and the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. As we come together today, take a moment and root yourself where you are situated. No matter where we are, we're all guests on this land. Let's remember this as we learn about our own relationship to the land and water and begin acknowledging that rich connection. Miigwech, hi, thank you. So welcome to today's discussion. I'm really excited to have this opportunity. When Sophia asked me to be part of this, I jumped on it because I'm going to admit I kind of fangirl some of the people that are in this in this panel, and I'm really honored to be here. So before we go any further, I would like to take some time and make some introductions. So our panelists today are Dr. Pamela Roach, Dr. Wayne Clark, Dr. Cheryl Barnaby, and our patient partner, Louise Crane. Dr. Roach is an assistant professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health Sciences at the University of Calgary, and is also the Director, Indigenous Health Education in the Office of Indigenous, Local, and Global Health for the Cumming School of Medicine. She is a PhD health researcher and member of the Métis Nation of Alberta, who has worked in a variety of academic and community healthcare settings, both in Canada and the UK, over the last 18 years. Her research focuses on Indigenous health, brain health, and dementia in underserved populations, and developing anti-racism educational interventions. Dr. Clark is the Executive Director of the Indigenous Health Initiatives Program in the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry at the University of Alberta. He was one of the first Inuit to earn a doctoral degree, and his research in cultural safety and education has helped to inform the process on how to engage Inuit communities in a health research context. Dr. Cheryl Barnaby is professor of the Department of Medicine and Community Health Sciences, Cumming School of Medicine, University of Calgary. She is a Métis Nation of Alberta member and originally comes from Southern Manitoba. She holds leadership roles in the University of Calgary as Vice Chair for Indigenous Health in the Department of Medicine, and as the Deputy Director for the McCaig Institute for Bone and Joint Health. She is a Canada Research Chair in Rheumatoid Arthritis and Autoimmune Diseases, and her research program focuses on equity in health service delivery and arthritis outcomes, most specifically for Indigenous populations in Canada. And finally, Louise Moist has osteoarthritis and worked with the Canadian Arthritis Patient Alliance for many years. The connection has enabled her to learn more about the disease and advocate for better understanding from the patient's point of view. She assisted in the development of a communication tool with the Arthritis Society of Canada on how to talk to your doctor. Welcome, everybody. So I'd like to get some perspectives from everybody. So I'm going to give you all an opportunity to share with us your thoughts and what they are on this topic. Is there anybody who would like to go first? I'm going to pick on names if I don't hear anybody volunteer.
I can begin then, Mary, for you.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl.
Okay, and thank you. And yes, good morning from Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3 and Treaty 7 territory. And as you were introducing the land, I unfortunately watched a squirrel get tangled up in some of my netting outside that was protecting my tomatoes. So hopefully the squirrel got out okay, for good. So the perspective I'm bringing to this panel is around working with patients and with communities in clinical research activities. So I come to this from a rheumatology perspective or an arthritis specialist perspective, where we know that there's great disparities around arthritis outcomes for First Nations in Alberta, for Indigenous peoples probably throughout Canada, although we have less confirmation of that through data. And one of the early things that I was challenged with was to not just be doing the research for the sake of describing problems or for saying where the gaps were, but it was actually to work on those aspects and make it better. So interventions, changing the system, and other large tasks like that. And the other thing I was challenged to do was to make sure that I was doing that work from the patient perspective and the community needs perspective, and not because I thought it was interesting or something that I thought would be easy for me to tackle in my work. And so it's involved quite a few years of understanding what the community needs are, what are the things that already exist in a community that we can begin to work with in creating some of that change that's necessary, but also around maintaining the relationships of that work over time, and not just saying, okay, we've fixed this one issue, I'm out, I'm done, I've done my job. It's, well, there's the next thing and the next thing. And sometimes that spills over. It's not necessarily contained to my area of clinical training or research. It might be, you know what, we need to do something to recover from floods, opioid crisis, COVID, whatever might have occurred, and being a partner in that and bringing in other helpers to the community for that work. I'm sorry, Mary, I believe you're on the mute silence thing right now.
Yeah, my cat was running around, so I had put myself on mute. My apologies. Pam, did you want to go next?
Sure. I think what Cheryl was saying about being a helper really resonates with me, because you know, I've worked in a lot of different areas, a lot of areas around mental health and cognitive health, but sometimes that's not what the community needs, right? Sometimes we identify something else, and so then you find the people who can help. And from my perspective, I tend to look at the system. So a lot of my work is in that health services research kind of area, but then thinking of where that intersects with how we train healthcare professionals. And so identifying those impacts later, that then we can really be reflective. We can look at what we're doing on the education side of things, and we can look at how to better innovate there and how to develop, you know, really much stronger competencies in the way that all of us as researchers, I think of everybody in the room, I see a lot of healthcare professionals, a lot of researchers, and starting to get people to really understand where their role is, and how what they do has an impact, even if they've not thought of it in that way before. So trying to take that systems approach of what are we seeing in the community, how is that? How does that play out because of what we're doing in the way we train people as well? So that's the kind of lens that I typically take with a lot of guidance from those around me, and focusing on those strengths as well, so we don't get bogged down and in the problems. We tend to problematize things in the academy, right? What's our problem that we're going to solve? And sometimes it's, what can we learn from communities that are doing things well? What can we learn from something that's working? And then how do we translate that into the other areas of work that we do?
Mm-hmm. That's true. Thank you, Pam. Louise, I'd like to hear from you. Hi.
Hi there. My point of view is strictly that of a patient who's been done wrong by medical professionals and researchers in the past. And what can I do? What have I done wrong? I've done a lot of research in social sciences, and I know I've made a lot of errors along the way in not looking at other people's point of view. So my perspective is, as a patient, what can we offer to help researchers and medical people move forward in their paths and journeys? And how can we have that information come back to us so that we can build a healthier, stronger life?
Thank you, Louise. Wayne, I'll bring you into the conversation. I'd like to hear what your perspectives are.
Sure, thank you, Mary. My thoughts are first sort of grounded in the fact that a lot of the research that has been conducted traditionally had, kept Indigenous perspectives away from participation in research, or there wasn't enough context, to their worldviews in specific scenarios. With my own community, there was, a history of, past wrongs that are still felt today. So there's a little bit of skepticism by community members whenever there's a research project at all, because we're so far north that the researchers that live in the community tend to be environmental scientists, and so when health researchers come, they're foreign to the community unless we have clinician researchers who like locum doctors and visiting nurses and some of the community health people that are in the community. There's not a lot of like the health sector is minimized. Most of Inuit that are living in say Nunavut or other parts of Inuit have to come to the south for treatment, and then there could be a context there where there's foreign. Sorry, I'm just getting some background. Like there's and not a full awareness of systems and so forth. So it's very intimidating. So the patient involvement in research that's conducted has to sort of take this perspective in. And so some of the studies that I've been involved with either look at how to incorporate Inuit Kaliamaktikangit, which is Inuit traditional knowledge. So it's very different from, say, First Nations or Métis perspectives, which is sometimes studied a little bit more because of the proximity of those communities to universities. And so the other thing is that a lot of times it's like it was mentioned already, the sort of like the othering, I suppose, that happens, and it's not necessarily looking at perspectives that are, I guess, strengths-based, or looking at some of the ways in which Inuit used to live, and that then creates a context of being othered, but also being oppressed. And I think there's an opportunity to not be looked at as marginalized, but that we have a long history and specific protocols that would be in the same light of some of the research practices that are institutionalized, but are, I would say, institutionalized in the culture, and that can be protocols that are determined by keepers of ceremony or practices that are important to how we lived with animals and the land and so forth, because that interconnectivity is so important to our health, and that's never really captured in in some of the clinical studies. But I think there's a way to do it. We're just, I think, at the cusp of doing that now.
Good, thanks, Wayne. You've all touched on some really good topics that I want to follow up on in terms of relationship building and strength-based research. But before we get to that, I want to ask any of you to chime in on the concept of why Indigenous issues are different than EDI. I'm going to go to you, Pam.
I was about to unmute and volunteer.
Okay, I'll give you points for that.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. I think EDI is important. We have these conversations a lot, but I find equity, diversity, and inclusion strategies or goals or objectives don't always get to the root of what we see when we see Indigenous people excluded from society, from the academy, from the healthcare system. And it's a bit different because it's not just this idea of finding ways to equitably get people, more diverse people, into a system or included in that system. But it's also about that system in and of itself being harmful, right? So we look at this system, most of our systems were created without Indigenous input, without Indigenous worldviews. So including Indigenous people in something that's been constructed purposefully to exclude them, but then also in a way that's not always helpful or positive, and sometimes is quite harmful, then it perpetuates that harmful structure. So I think when we're talking about Indigenous inclusion, we talk about truth and reconciliation, we talk about all of these things, that's bringing in a different worldview, a different paradigm, different ways of knowing and being and doing, to create maybe a different system, a different way of doing things that in and of itself lends itself to becoming more equitable and more inclusive, but only looking at EDI from a Western lens continues to exclude Indigenous people. So I think it's really important to kind of make that distinction, that there's legislative policies, there's history, there's structures that have been built that Indigenous people continue to have to operate within, that don't always mean that, despite all of the EDI strategies in the world, doesn't mean that those systems become any safer for them. And so I think that's why when we see, there's often EDI groups and then Indigenous groups and operating alongside each other, right? And I think about many of the elders that work with the university often talking about parallel paths, and they operate together, but equal and independent, because there are specific considerations when we think about including different groups, if that's helpful. I feel I was a bit rambly. But.
No, I find this very helpful, Pam. Wayne or Cheryl, did you want to weigh in on this?
I'm going to leap in with that.
Sure, Louise.
Because I have a, in looking at things for today, EDI is not something I was familiar with as a term as such. So I did in my homework. And I was thrilled when I came across the website at SAIT. And they have a statement of equity, diversity, and inclusion provides the conditions for a healthy campus where everybody feels welcome, supported, included, and valued, empowered to succeed. And I thought, wow, what a cool statement. And I was sitting there, do they really follow that? And then I was thinking back, for the last 3 years, I've been supporting my grandson going through SAIT, and he embraces his Métis identity, and has some education struggles and learning issues. And he thrived there. They included him. They had special ceremonies for all the students, but they made sure that he had a point where, as a Métis perspective was asked for in his graduation. You know, he had a lot of questions from everybody about his sash, and with the meaning of the sash, and he was able to interpret that for them, translate that knowledge. And so it made it a healthy place for him, and it made him grow. And I was really, really pleased to see that, because as the 3 words is from a patient's point of view, and a woman and a member of the Aboriginal community, I felt that I donated my blood, literally, my cells, my story. But the research was collected as a research subject, not as a partner. And I feel that I should be seen as an equal partner and wanted to be respected as such. So yeah, that I want to just give that little story.
That's a great perspective. I'm sure, did he share with you how he felt being able to explain the meaning of the sash and things like that too? Like, you know, owning that and being able to, you know, to share that with others?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Totally. And I'm glad somebody said here that they say, I use acronyms just like everybody else and forget that some people might not know what it is, but it is our technology school here in Calgary. So, no, he was, he came out of there very proud, because the graduation, yes, they did have a separate one for their Aboriginal students. However, in the bulk graduation ceremony, they were very, very included. So I felt they were actually putting their words to action, which I would like to see more of.
Mm-hmm. That's good. I guess he didn't have any pushback into wearing his sash and things like that either.
No.
No, no,
No.
that's good to see, because I know.
This is a young man who got beat up and had his braids cut off in grade 1. So that how it's changed for him. It's been awesome.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's good. It's good for him to see that evolution just in his own experiences. I'm sure it gives him hope.
Mm-hmm.
That's good to see. Wayne, did you have any thoughts on separating EDI and Indigenous issues?
I do. I feel as though EDI is as important as it is, and it continues to play a significant role in academic settings. It was developed by non-Indigenous peoples, and I believe there's some underpinnings that are related to policy that are Euro-Western in nature. And I think that when we consider an Indigenous perspective on, you know, sex and gender, for example, there certainly are, you know, beliefs and traditions in that area, which I won't get totally into, but there's other ways in which diversity is even considered in terms of, you know, families and societal structures. And how that gets incorporated into research is based on, you know, an Indigenous research paradigm. So I think it's already there. It's just there with a different lens. But the EDI policies can exclude that again, like they have with other kinds of, you know, Euro-Western approaches. So I think that even when we consider like, conceptual frameworks that look at data and methodologies and specific kinds of research approaches, those would get lost in some EDI literature, I'm afraid. And it is quite new in terms of, how do we look at approaching this? And as much as I would want to support that, I think it's important that the community has a voice in the various communities, and that's where maybe we find the diversity. I think as an Inuk, I know that there isn't a lot of Inuk, like Inuk-led research in the academy, for example. So the EDI or that aspect, maybe there's not enough equity, but just in terms of the overall concept of EDI, there's still a fair amount of work that we need to do just to even be at the table, to participate in any other kind of issue that comes up in research. So sex and gender is another one that's that we're being faced with. It's in research now. We need to identify how or if it's impacting within research studies, and so that's certainly good for a whole number of reasons. But we're still at a point where we need to be included and start thinking of ways in which that we have some kind of structure, whether that's formally or informally, with academics.
Hello, maybe.
Thanks, Wayne. I'll follow up in a few minutes. Cheryl, did you want to weigh in on this conversation?
Yeah. I'm also just reading through the chat, and somebody's brought up the aspect of rights, and I think that that's an important piece to add to this too. Certainly, there are so many populations who've had their rights infringed on, and certainly as the first peoples in the territories that has become Canada and that was taken over and colonized. I think a lot of the tendency in the academy has been to just lump global health and lump Indigenous and lump, all the other aspects, religion, sex and gender, whatever it might be. And these are all basic human rights to be protected upon. And yet we must always remember the history of our nation and where this land has come from, where the privilege has come from. And that's why this has such a distinct and unique context, because those rights were infringed upon and it has not yet been fixed. It's not been completed, that process of apology and reconciliation. And that's another really important piece that we can never forget, of why there are such unique issues when it comes to Indigenous health and research. And the other aspect is that I think it's very easy for people to think, well, these were all historic events and these were things that happened a long time ago. But in fact, all of our structures, our education system, research, health, justice, economies, all of it was built on colonial aspects. And so everything that we still see today is still very much colonial structure and power and decision making. So we have to think about that in the context of absolutely everything we do within a research paradigm.
Great. So how, and you've touched on it, Cheryl, and I'll open it up to anybody who wants to answer, but how does that two-eyed seeing balance things like technology and, the things that are done, in a Western way and the things that are done, in a traditional way? How do you guys find that balance?
I'm going to weigh in on that. I was just thinking of, it's a hard balance sometimes, but it is something that we do, and some better than others. A few years ago, part of my healing journey, I was involved at Johns Hopkins programs for Indigenous health, and I met Dr. Evan Adams, from BC, and he was telling me about two-eyed seeing. And him and I were discussing the whole issue of living and trying to follow our Aboriginal ways of doing things in a white colonial world. And the experiences I had throughout my life in the way of working with doctors through my arthritis and pain control, where I've had doctors sort of say I was drug seeking because I'm one of those people who always go look for drugs. And my experiences were different because I wasn't looked at as an expert within my body. And it's one thing Evan Adams had told me is that you are an expert at that. You're also an expert with your history and the history of your family and your identity. And we should be more comfortable to share our stories without being judged. So in that, merging the two worldviews have been a challenge, but we take the strengths from both and just continue to grow and move forward.
Thanks, Louise. I enjoy your stories. Great sharing. Anybody else want to share how they balance that?
Sure, I'll jump in. I think two-eyed seeing as a concept is brilliant. In that the elder Albert Marshall, who coined the phrase, was looking at ways in which to get young people involved in science, but still sort of maintain and have curiosity of their own traditions, or looking at ecology or other scientific phenomena from an Indigenous perspective. What I think happens sometimes in the academy is there's, it's almost like looking at specific research issues and making room for Indigenous perspectives that I think can be standalone and don't necessarily need those other perspectives to legitimize them. And I feel that that's something that's been institutionalized. So it's a bit of a critique on if it was a funding requirement to incorporate two-eyed seeing into a study, that just to force it to legitimize the Indigenous side of things. So I feel as though that we can do research with, construct multiple realities without having to necessarily look at it from a two-eyed perspective. And so I think I was mentioning earlier about, some of the Indigenous approaches that can or need to be included into science, and more so because there is a tradition of, innovation and science in our own communities, certainly with, plants and medicine and other understandings of the world. And these haven't necessarily, like the process of doing research from that perspective, like that positivist lens in science, doesn't necessarily apply to how we may do something in a research paradigm. So that's Indigenous. So sometimes that Indigenous research paradigm doesn't fit with the science that is conducted with that other lens. So I feel it can work, but they need to be equal at the same time, like 2020 vision.
Exactly. Thank you, Wayne. That's sort of how I picture it when I think of two-eyed seeing. Pam or Cheryl, did you want to add anything?
I can go ahead. I think it informs how I approach methods of the research, and even at just the beginning of the research is around focusing on relationship building. So I think what Western-based research methods would say is, well, you have to be completely objective with the data you collect, You know, people, you have to go through that lengthy consent form and you can't say a word to them unless they've consented to talk to you or complete your survey, whatever it might be, right? It's a very, the Western approach would be very hands-off to keep that research very rigorous and meet, you know, standards for whatever. And I think that that's exactly the way that is wrong, actually, to work with communities and patients and research. You can't just pop in and be very objective and collect exactly what you're, you know, set out to do. You have to actually build that relationship first, get to know people first, understand the context, understand the underlying before you can make any sense of what the research answers are or the research findings are. I think it's also a bit of a different approach in terms of, I think, again, Western-based systems will want you to be very competitive. So you're not going to share what you're planning to do with other investigators. You're not going to share and, you know, how you're approaching a specific research topic or whatever it might be. And I very much try to approach it from a very collaborative way with my colleagues or with my students. We're not here to actually beat each other. It's not actually about who brings in the most money, who writes the biggest, most important papers. It's around how can we pull everybody's expertise together to actually make a really sound solution to this. How do we bring each other up and support each other throughout that journey, as opposed to it being about protecting everything for yourself? So I see it as more of a giving way of working with others, not just the people that are participating in the research, but the entire team around me. And some of the best outcomes that have come from research is when we pull together all of those people from different disciplines. We feed off of each other. I learn lots, they learn too. And it's a real sharing, which I think is a much more cultural approach, and gets us to where we need to be, which is actually improving the on the ground health outcomes that people have been facing.
Thanks, Cheryl. That was going to be one of my follow-up questions, and you nailed it. Pam, I'd like to hear what you'd have to say.
Sure. I think it's hard not to kind of just echo what everybody has contributed so far, but I really think, you know, it's that idea of for so long, this Western way of doing research has been, you know, privileged in the way we talk about research, right? So that's what we say is objective. And I really appreciate Cheryl touching on that objectiveness, because I think what is objective? What do we class as objective, right? And that's very much based in a Western approach to everything, to the way we look at the world, to the way we look at science. And so without getting all too far into it, but that's a really great example of something we call epistemic racism, right? Which is like this deeply embedded racist view of the world, where we actually don't acknowledge other worldviews and other ways of doing things. And so I think being able to approach our work and our relationships, you know, with that idea of like, there's good things about Western research. There's good things about Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous approaches to research. And for me, it's just that prioritizing of relationships. And I think that's exactly it. If our goal is to help community and work for community, work for people to improve outcomes, that's our job. That's I was thinking, even within the context of education and that kind of work, my job is to improve the community within the school for the students and for the Indigenous students, right? Those are what I'm trying to do. So to do that, I need the strengths from different systems. I need the strengths of my colleagues around me, and I need, you know, the strengths of everything. So it's that idea of relating to each other on a really human level, right? That's what we're trying to do. And we relate to each other, we relate to the world around us on that really, really fundamental level. And if we understand that, then we will move forward. We will use those strengths from different systems to do the best work we can. And it may not always look like what Western research tells us it should look like. But I think as we embed that more and more into the way we do things, hopefully we have conversations like this, and more people who perhaps haven't thought about it start to think about it and start to learn about a different way to approach what we do.
Mhm. Absolutely. One of the things that's been sort of going through my head as I've been hearing you talking is about we all talk about building relationships and how important that is. And Cheryl, you really touched on it really well. But I'm just curious because I know we have a lot of non-Indigenous researchers in the room as well. And I just how has it ever been challenging for you to build relationships either in your own communities or in communities, other Indigenous communities that you've just entered? How has that relationship building gone for you?
I
Louise is chomping at the bit.
I need to share a story this last week when you talk about different communities. I have to say that I was sent a challenge, and we always believe that Creator sends us a challenge so we can learn something. And sometimes we like our learnings and sometimes we don't. And I have to say that my challenge lately was, and you look at it from 2 points of view, is that I've always been very narrow-minded. Even when I was a social worker, I was very, I caught myself early in my career sort of having this narrow mind of the lazy drunks, all these people that we were dealing with. I labeled them really well. And I had to stop myself and see it from a different point of view and open my lenses, as it were, and see a more rounded picture, which fortunately for my clients, I had some good mentors that sort of, bopped me on the head and said, Louise, that's not the way it's done. So recently I was given another challenge. And it was in a challenge where in an area I know nothing about, is that I saw my son-in-law had a sex change and is now my daughter-in-law, I guess. I haven't yet come to terms with this, but I was really shocked, and I was more shocked at my attitude and my narrow-mindedness. So that challenge, I'm still struggling with it. But then I turned back into my Aboriginal viewpoints and teachings that were taught to me about the strengths of two-spirited people, and seeing it from both worlds, the male and female, and that they're extra strong people. So it's as I say, I'm still working through it, but I keep on digging into my culture and seeing how, where I should learn and where I should put my learning in this process, in this point of view.
How's your relationship with her now?
Great. It always has. It just happens to be a fabulous person. And I'm just putting my head around, do her kids to call her dad or mom? Minor things that I struggle with. And he just, or she, because I got to get used to the new terms, they giggle about it.
That's a good attitude. I mean, it's a big shift for everybody, right?
For sure.
But if you're open and willing, yeah, that's part of our ways of knowing, for sure, for sure.
I guess I can share next, Mary. So as you mentioned in my introduction, I'm not from this province or this treaty area. I come from somewhere else. And so growing up and going through my training, I became very used to the way it was of Cree and Ojibwe people, because that's where I grew up. And then I came to Treaty 7 territory, and it took me actually, I really just observed and watched and tried to learn for those first few years. So what are the protocols of the place that I've come to, understanding more about the history of those treaties or that treaty, and then also of how things are structured in that community. And I think that we can't begin to work with any group unless we do our own preparation and homework to understand more. And then that gives you some understanding of a way to approach people respectfully to begin that work. Some of the early activities too were that people who were already working with those communities would be the source of introduction. So it wasn't just me cold calling somebody or emailing somebody and saying, hey, I want to work with you. It was around learning, working with those people, meeting with them, coming to understand what was important for the community. Was there a place for me to approach, and then having those introductions made for me? But again, not coming in to sort of force myself in there and saying I'm your I'm here to save you. It was around what is it that I can do to help, actually, and being open to being told it might be different things than what I might have expected to have done. So it was getting to understand the local processes and protocols first.
Thanks, Cheryl.
I'm going to leap in there because I have to congratulate Cheryl. We did a project out at Siksika together. And honestly, she put two of her researchers on this program to meet with some elders and I was invited to tag along. And honestly, I never saw such awesome protocol that they followed. I felt they went in prepared, the two researchers from Cheryl's group. They went in prepared, but they also were, throughout the process, learned, they made a couple of faux pas and whatnot, but it was minor because they went in expecting, yeah, we are going to make mistakes, but how they handled it was beautiful. And I really feel that community was respected. And all the elders had an opportunity to have voice on the project, and both negative and positive. So it was really great to see. And I don't think I've ever seen one since. So there you go. Kudos, Cheryl.
Thanks, Louise. We're, full disclosure, we've known each other a long, long time. Thanks, Louise. Thanks for being a part of that too. It was really important for the community members who hadn't been engaged in research to have someone with Louise's experience to help guide them as well, and be that bridge when we didn't realize there was something we needed to explain better, or something that we weren't understanding that Louise could help us understand too. So we really appreciate that.
Pam, any thoughts? Anything to add?
I think I want to thank Louise for her story and for sharing that with us really in a really vulnerable way. And I think it's a lovely analogy for the learning that many people are coming to when we're, a lot more people are engaging with Indigenous issues and Indigenous research now. And it's that shift, right? And we all make shifts as things change, as society changes, as people change, right? We have to shift in the way we think. And I think sometimes that's hard, and sometimes it struggles. There's struggles for us. And I think that's okay. And I think as people want to learn about working with Indigenous communities, you will experience those shifts. And that's okay. And there's some lovely comments in the chat around feeling uncomfortable, being comfortable, feeling uncomfortable. And someone said that they're working really hard to learn, but they're a work in progress. And, we're all works in progress. Nobody's created in a perfect way, right? That would be, for any of us to think we're perfect, would be quite arrogant. The creator doesn't make anybody perfect, right? We all have learnings to do. And I had some significant learnings in the last couple of years that I needed, right? That were set in front of me. So I think that's okay. We're all works in progress. We're all in it together. And I think that's the important thing. We're in it together. We can relate to each other. And it's that observing and learning, like Cheryl said. And I think so many times I find myself observing right? Like, because we all need to learn things. So observing, learning, doing some of the work, asking questions, and knowing we're going to get it wrong sometimes. And that's okay, right? We're all going to get it wrong, and just understanding there's being humble about when we get it wrong and willing to learn.
And I think sometimes too, it's really important to sit in that discomfort and sort of just almost listen to what it's trying to teach you or what it's trying to tell you. I think we're so quick to just sort of dismiss it or push it aside and keep going that we're missing opportunities by sort of sitting in that awkwardness or sitting in that silence sometimes. So so yeah, like you say, we're given things when we're ready to learn them. So be ready. Thanks, Pamela. Wayne, my screen keeps shifting, but Wayne, I'd like to hear from you on this.
Sure, thank you. I think that, well, first of all, I want to say that I was trained by First Nations women when I got into research, and they encouraged me to do a master's degree and do a doctorate. And if it wasn't for those First Nations women, I wouldn't be where I am. I would be somewhere else. And so a lot of the things that I learned were grounded in First Nations protocols, recognizing that I needed to go and find out my own and go back up north. And so it was about understanding that relationality, I guess, that respects, that accountability to the process. And so when I learned that from these women, I was able to then do that with my own community, which of course was an amazing gift to have. And so like the others, I'm also a guest on Treaty 6, and now I'm building relationships with Enoch and some of the other communities. And I'd like to get to as many of them as possible so that there's partnerships in place, and I'll take what I've learned from my previous experiences to these. And I think that once you're there, you bring that with you, and I think there's a really good healthy like respect for doing this together and recognizing our differences. And I think as Indigenous people, there's sometimes a welcoming to one another. And so that's been something that I've noted when I got here, which was only about 3 or 4 months ago. So I've already had the privilege of meeting with some communities, and I'm just so excited to start working with them in ways in which that can support some of the things that look at whether it's transformational or social change, or looking at the issues that they wish to, that they would like us to study.
You've got some ambitious plans. I think it's cool. But I'm sure you'll get it done. I'm sure you'll get it done. So I just want to move at this point. I want to move to more of a conversation on strength-based research. We had a patient partner in the network that I'm involved in who was very fierce in his belief that we need to center conversations on wellness instead of illness. And I believe it was sort of touched. Pamela, you kind of talked about it before, where we talk about, solving problems as opposed to, and always coming in with that problem solving sort of methodology or mindset. So in terms of looking at it from a strength-based point of view, why do you feel that this is a paradigm shift for many researchers?
I guess I feel that was kind of, I can jump in. So, I think it is a little bit of a shift, and I don't know if it's in all cases. I certainly see it in the way we talk about Indigenous health, and particularly when teaching around Indigenous health as well. I think there's been a history of non-Indigenous people largely, when they teach about Indigenous health, or when they want to do work and research with Indigenous people, to identify problems and then talk a lot about the problems, maybe without that in-depth structural understanding of where those things came from, right? So if we're looking at differential health impacts, or the AFNIGC, sorry, Alberta First Nations Information Governance Center, acronyms. They have a website where they have lots of one-pagers on different health conditions that we can look at and see the data. There's a trend or a habit to talk about those problems without talking about those big social and political and structural drivers that led to those outcomes. So then I think that shift, that paradigm shift, is really looking at, well, what are the things that Indigenous people do well to protect their own health? And a lot of that is connected to self-governance and self-determination. If people have the ability to determine for themselves and define health for themselves, then it's those natural things that have largely been interrupted by these big processes like colonization, right? And so, I mean, these are big things and big concepts to talk about, but it's looking at what are those things that connect us to each other, connect us to the land. What do we know inherently as Indigenous people? And what can we continue to learn from elders and knowledge keepers who hold that information to benefit future generations, right? So looking at what we do well, and finding a way to promote that, to help us understand that better in the face of these big structures that are pushing against us.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'll hand it over because I feel like I tend to keep talking. It's because I do a lot of lecturing. I tend to just start and I just go.
No, that's great. That's great, Pam. Not a problem. Anybody else? I'm just going to open it up to anybody who wants to add.
Sure, I'll jump because I think Pam is completely right around, self-determination, self-governance, sovereignty. It's the language that is important when we, look at research issues and how we frame the, that perspective that is incorporating those, as well as looking at, like construction of the research approaches that we'll take. And one of the things that that I looked at was, changing, like looking at that really truly Indigenous research paradigm. And it was looking at more traditional ways of working with elders and finding, consensus from other community members after the elders had spoken, and then finding ways that looked at sort of the positive things in a not so positive issue of diabetes. And we just learned so much about the different ways that you could look at diabetes from an Inuit perspective. And I thought that was so interesting, but it's not the usual way we look at diabetes. So I think too, like even just looking at so that we could do knowledge translation with community. So there's ways to understand the research issues, sometimes complicated scientific issues, medical issues that are not something that somebody would want to go and take a look at, a journal article or something like that. But thinking about if there's conceptual frameworks like in the context of an Indigenous mind set that looked at bundles and totems and other depictions of philosophy, and I'm sort of getting into some of the theory here, but there needs to be that piece that communities can relate to. Otherwise, it's shelved afterward. And if knowledge translation can be done in such a way where, I think about maybe 10 years ago, we were doing fact sheets and at the National Aboriginal Health Organization, and the thinking then was, okay, let's put some photos up and some imagery up and then let's make this Indigenous. But it's not just like hanging a dream catcher in the window. It's more like a matter of really thinking about how does this translate. And one of the other things that is important is language. And so some of the community members that I spoke with didn't speak English, so the knowledge that they shared was in Inuktitut. And so, what's the place of language in how this information is shared, and what translation occurs from the research process that communities can benefit from.
That language piece is really important too. I think for, in both ways, either to try and preserve the language, or like you say, to try and translate from people who don't speak English and have so much knowledge to share and are willing to share it. Louise or Cheryl, do you have any thoughts?
I'll step in. Through the Patient Alliance that I've been working with, they have sent me to a lot of conferences and workshops, education sessions that I thoroughly enjoyed. And along with that, that education that I got, even though it came from a Western perspective, educated me more about my body. And then I was able to go back to my community and ask them, and thanks to Cheryl's project out at Siksika, got me thinking about, that was a Blackfoot community, and I'm a Métis of Cree heritage. So what does it look like from a Cree perspective? And actually one of the Blackfoot elders there said, now you know about us, go back and learn about your own people. And I love that. I love that whole idea there. So I was challenged to do my homework, and given the diversity of the Aboriginal community, each had its own protocols and norms. So I had to ask myself, what stories have I collected? How are they shared, evaluated? Will they remain whole? And the last question was what will this knowledge transfer look like at the end? And would it come back to the community in a way that the community would understand? And again, as Wayne mentioned, that the language barriers in there, even though these communities we work with around Calgary are close, there's still a lot of non-English speakers. And we have to acknowledge that, is that all that information going back to the community, is it going back in their language, in their way of understanding? Are they perhaps using the medicine wheel approach of being holistic and put in a format that they can totally understand in their ways? I had an opportunity a while back where we're out visiting a medicine wheel, and it's a rock formation that we have depicting wholeness and wellness. And the elders were talking about how we were trying to give them the feedback from our last research project we had with them. And they kept on saying, but it doesn't cover this area. How's it going to help? We see how it helps us physically. We see how it helps us mentally. We see how the education is helping our, emotions and whatnot. But what's it doing for us spiritually? Is it inclusive enough? And how do you interpret that? And how do you take something that's very academic and put it into that framework?
Wow. Food for thought for sure.
I guess I'll jump in with one other element of this, and that's around making sure that we've also got researchers and students, because I know there's a variety of people on the webinar today listening in. But how do we also do this from a wellness perspective from us, right? So we've all, been in a room where, you can tell someone's edgy or someone's really irritable or someone's, sending off like really ugliness, right? Like they're not in a good place that day. And we've had the good fortune of working with Dr. Andrea Kennedy from Mount Royal University, and then also elders from Treaty 7, as well as from Hawaii, who we had graduate students work on making themselves healthy and better, so that when they did work with community, when they did anything around mentoring others, all of this, that they were doing it because they were in a really good place too. We can't do a good job of working with people or supervising trainees or working with community if we're not good ourselves. And so we need to have that embedded in all that we do as well, is that it's, and sometimes we might be working on research that's really, really tough topics. And for people who haven't experienced firsthand some of the traumas that Indigenous people face, or who are just learning about some of these. I'm thinking about even this summer when the children at residential schools were found in mass graves. That was really hard for a lot of people to process, and we need to make space in our research activities for helping everyone debrief some of those aspects. Or if someone is sharing a very traumatic part of their story in your research work, that we need to make sure that we're taking good care of ourselves and able to receive those stories and demonstrate compassion back to the people that are sharing that with us, so that we really do that research in a good way.
It's I think people need to remember that we don't like live in a vacuum. Like all these things are happening around us and they affect us. Like, there's COVID, there's the children that have been found, and all of these other things that are happening too, and not just to Indigenous people, but to everybody. And you can't just sort of, be in that silo and just pretend the outside world isn't happening and won't affect what's going on. And I found even, with the work that we were doing too, that of course COVID, put a stop to a lot of the work because we're doing work in communities. So traveling to communities was, was a real challenge. But also, once those 215 were originally found in Kamloops, I think for all of us where I work, for all the Indigenous people where I work, it was it really, you looked at things in a different way too, and it really I don't know, it just we were working on some land acknowledgement work, and for example, and we all just sort of stopped and realized that everything had a different meaning. It took on a different meaning because of what was going on at the time, and you can't ignore that. I don't think you can ignore that. So I know, Pam, you already spoke about this, didn't you? I'm losing track now. I'm making you talk again.
That's okay. Actually, I wouldn't mind jumping in. I think these are really, I'm not sure this is the direction we were planning on going, but I think this is really important. I know when there was the 215, when the 751 children were found, that was a big number, right? And I think it shocked a lot of people. And I had a student having their master's defense that day. And it is in Indigenous health and housing and all of those kinds of things. And there was myself and another Indigenous faculty member on the exam committee. There was the student, and I think considering everybody that's in the room, thinking about the relationships you have with your Indigenous colleagues, that these things are traumatic to hear. And then think about like that extra piece for some of us where, we had a conversation that morning do we want the exam to go ahead? And absolutely, we did go ahead, right? When you think about the student and their program, but we made space in that exam. We made space to talk about what was happening at the start. And we spent a good chunk of time doing that. And I think allowing ourselves to feel those things and having that compassion for each other, so that, you know, when you send that email saying, oh, hey, I'm starting to engage with the TRC, can I talk to you about this thing I did? Just know that if you're prompted to do that because of something that's been in the media, that your colleagues might be dealing with it on a different level, right? So just always kind of starting to come around to that idea that there's all these things that you see happening, all of events, right, that will happen. When we think of Indigenous Peoples Month, largely it's the Indigenous people working within our systems who are facilitating those events. So that's great that we have these events to connect to each other. But then there's that extra piece of work that other members of your research team, that other members of the faculty, that other students aren't expected to do, right? So I think the more people that can engage with this, the more people that can be brought in to do the good work in a good way, the better it is for everybody. And it becomes more equitable because there's a less of a demand put on the rest of us. And I think just flagging that in the way that we work, that, you know, you might think that you're reaching out to a community to talk about a project and maybe they're interested in it, but there could be some other contextual factors happening as well that I love what Cheryl said about being compassionate for each other, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Any other thoughts on this? Louise, did you have any thoughts or?
Just one last point, just is I love the idea of challenging people. I've had my challenges, so now I'm just throwing it back at you. And then I want to challenge everybody listening today to look at where are their views are narrowed. And if we can expand our minds to see the many facets of this world, and not just through two eyes, but many eyes. And I also challenge you to open your eyes, and I go back to that quote from Sate was, you know, where are you making everybody feel welcome, supported, included, and valued, and empowered? Are you giving them the power to succeed? And I'll leave you with that.
Thank you, Louise.
I would just like to say, in terms of you know, respecting the events of this past year, that you know, we're at a certain place in time where, you know, we have a national holiday coming up, and it's been 6 years since the TRC report was released and calls to action published. And I think institutions need to look at where we are at with, you know, making the changes necessary. And then also, like, just within society, like, you know, where, like, how much of those legacy calls have been implemented, because they're complex and they're, you know, entrenched in our in policy and legislation and systems and structures. So, you know, we're not going to get there overnight, but it has been 6 years, and there's some things that we maybe should have done already, or we should be more further along with. And there's still a lot of, I think, a lack of knowledge about what had happened in the first place, which is why we had the response from, you know, Canada and the media about what happened with, you know, with the missing children. So this breaks down in many ways. And I think that it is important for people to recognize that, and that especially our allies or our other partners, because we need to do this work together.
You're right, Wayne. You're absolutely right. We do have to do this together. I do want to take the conversation into a different direction, because there was one more thing that I wanted to ask you about. And when we did our prep, Wayne, you sort of touched on it in terms of faculty education and integrating into formal education as part of the process of deconstructing colonial structures. I don't know if you wanted to expand on that.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for recalling that. And since then, since we last met, Mary, I was speaking with a medical program in the faculty where there's an opportunity to look at, different kinds of, residency opportunities. And I think that when we integrate Indigenous health into, like post-secondary learning, essentially, or with the specialization areas in medicine, there still isn't, because a lot of the new cultural safety training, anti-racism training, historic, pieces that weren't necessarily part of, the curriculum in graduate medical education or any other discipline. There's a need to educate the faculty because they may not have had this, or we still get that perspective that, well, that's not the British, medical education standard, and that our treatments are just, therapeutic, versus, or there was some other term that I think you might have used that, essentially was, not defined as clinical. And, that's the kind of thinking that we have to move away from. And so the Royal College of Canada has put out a Indigenous health primer that looks at, self-determination, Indigenous, rights, traditional medicine, and so forth. And there's a number of areas there, like that talk about data and other things that are, I think, important for MDs to look at, or clinicians to look at. And I say that because we're talking about sport today. If we don't get there, then, we're missing opportunities to look at really good data. Sometimes we're not reflected in the data that, the aggregate data that exists, or it's very difficult to get at. So that's starting to change now, thankfully. But the faculty education is very important because they are often the drivers of some of these changes. And I think they're relatively easy. Well, they're not really easy, but we could do a lot of work in 5 years on some of this stuff if they had had some of this, knowledge in place, or some of this training previously. So I think that's something that we've not necessarily seen in the best light yet. And we've got a ways to go. And I think that's right across the country. It's not just specifically Alberta, but that'll be an important step. And I think it'll be important for the universities to recognize, like, what does that look like, and how can we do that? There's all kinds of faculty education that exists. So we need to do better there too.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts?
We do. I think I agree with Wayne. Right? I think faculty development is such a priority. We see that we can do lots and lots of teaching with students and learners, or we would like to do lots and lots of teaching. We do as much as we can, but without other people being able to contribute to the teaching, there's so few Indigenous faculty to continue to do it. So part of it is that faculty development piece for their own learning, for their own research. And then part of it is also to be able to really reach the learners and to create this programming. We need support. Especially when you think about clinical learners out in the community, and preceptors, like working with community docs who will be precepting students to understand all of the things that we've been talking about today, right? The difference between EDI and Indigenous inclusion, strengths-based work, all of those kinds of things, and relationality, to be able to embed that in the way that they work and they teach. So that's a huge priority. I also think, developing our leaders, so that people currently in leadership positions, because when we think about some of those big structural changes that need to happen, there's people who are in positions with the decision-making power to make those decisions, right? And sometimes if you think of analogous situations where decisions had to be made unilaterally for the sake of civil rights or human rights, and things like gay marriage, or the getting rid of segregation laws and the Jim Crow laws in the United States, had you asked for public votes or referendums on those issues, you wouldn't have had common support for those decisions. But it's the point where you know that there's decisions that are the right decisions that need to be made. So it's empowering the people currently in leadership positions as well to understand those decisions, to understand that how that is in their sphere of influence and in their scope of work, and to make those decisions along with Indigenous community members, along with Indigenous faculty, to have the guidance, but to be able to say like, okay, no, we've got to look at this structure, we've got to look at this policy, and we need it to change. And so that's part of that faculty development, I think, that hits on those structural levels too.
Thank you, Pam. Cheryl, Louise, any thoughts about faculty education?
I might be taking it off on a bit of a different direction, but it relates to how it picks up on Pam's point around how this has to be embedded in every single aspect. So it's kind of like when we're now having to write a sex and gender section for CIHR grants or whatever it might be. So, you know, there was a bit of helping to bring people along and understanding some of those differences, and people have to do a module, but then they have to apply it to their work and make it clear that they understand some of those concepts. And I don't want this to be taken wrong. I'm very, very supportive that we do that. But I am trying to have people see that we have to embed those aspects of equity and Indigenous health in all of the work too. So it has been a bit of a dagger through my heart, to be honest, when I get feedback, oh, I didn't address sex and gender well enough in my proposal. And I'm like, well, but nobody else has to talk about Indigenous health and all the other aspects of equity in their work. And so how do we, and so we're all challenged to do better. When we do our presentations about our work, I think we all need to actually talk about all the aspects of equity as it relates to that specific area of inquiry, or how you've analyzed data, or how you're sharing results and making sure that it gets disseminated, because there'd be different strategies for different groups or populations, and all of it affects everybody, right? everything that we do will affect Indigenous people. Everything that we do will affect men and women. Everything that we do will affect people of different age transitions, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that we have to quit thinking, this is just a standalone, and that, there's specific people who do this work. Everything we do affects everybody in our classroom could be Indigenous, and we may not recognize it or know it. So we have to teach in different ways. So I just want people to keep having that broader aspect, that everything we do is impacting a different group. And so be prepared. learn what you need to know.
Always a challenge, right, Cheryl? Louise, did you have any thoughts, or do you want to add anything?
Well, I thought it was interesting because when you talk about the curriculum and whatnot, is that I was hired many years ago by Bow Valley College to develop an Aboriginal social work curriculum. And I was sitting there, why does it have to be Aboriginal? Why is not the regular social work, why is this curriculum not being taught to everybody? Why does it have to be Aboriginal specific sort of thing? So based on what sort of Cheryl said, is that it has to be more included in the actual curriculum and not segregated as Aboriginal, because if you really look at the true meaning of EDI, if you followed it, there wouldn't be a barrier in that, because everybody would be included. And so I actually developed this Aboriginal curriculum. And I'm very happy to say that it's now the social work curriculum for Bow Valley College, because they said, you know, why do we need a separate course or a separate thing? We needed it all included.
So your course was something that was adapted for everybody.
The whole curriculum on every subject.
Amazing. 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 I'm just sort of thinking, if there was one thing, as we're kind of sitting here, we're kind of like sitting around the kitchen table with this, you know, having this chat. I hope somebody in somebody's family makes a really good bannock, because I know my bannock making sucks. But we're having tea, we're having bannock, and sort of having this chat, right? But if you could tell people one thing to take away from all of this, what would it be?
I'll start, and I think it's around first thanking the people that are here listening in, who are making those steps in their learning. I think that's incredible. We need everybody to do the same. So you know, you're all little seeds, and you all impact and interact with other people, and can spread that message. But I really think the take-home message is to think around how we work, how we do research, how we train, how we mentor, how we study, all of those things, to be more open to a different way that you're going to need to learn about. And because this has not been part of Canadian society. And if you're someone who is Indigenous on this, I know that we're all on different identity journeys as well. And that we have lots to learn about all of our kin in the community. So we're all a big part of spreading this message around being open to working in different ways and thinking in different ways.
Thanks, Cheryl.
I can go next. I think likewise that we see more and more people engaging with these concepts, and I do appreciate everybody taking that time. I think for me, I would love for people to start thinking about the work they do and start to try to spot those areas that you haven't considered before, right? So try to look for those things. Have I ever in my work, even though like you might be doing machine learning, you might be doing administrative data research, you might be doing a very specific project, interviewing white women about their experiences about something, right? But have you ever thought about those social contextual pieces that maybe you've not considered before that may play into whatever it is you're looking to improve? So start to examine those things. And then I think just on that concept of relationality, I saw someone just put in the chat, we have so much to learn from learners. And recently a learner brought up a concept to me. We talk a lot, it's not for this conversation, around something called lateral violence, but they brought up this idea of lateral kindness. And I think maybe if we move through our work, right, really thinking about being kind and you know, coming from the heart, doing the work from the heart to improve things for the people we're working with, right? We're working with each other in a relational way, and just working together to get the best outcome. And that'll really pull in a lot of the concepts we've pulled from today. So think about that and maybe start trying to identify those spaces in your work that you've not given a lot of thought and consideration to before.
That's awesome. It almost echoes that framework of thinking about wellness instead of illness, right? It's thinking about something good, that lateral kindness instead of a lateral violence. That's really interesting. And, you know, sometimes you just need to sort of hear it for it to make sense, right? So I really appreciate that. Louise or Wayne, You have any thoughts?
I was just thinking that when there's so many people online for this, the takeaway is that I just wanted everybody to try to keep their minds open to their own flaws. You know, as I said, this last month I've been caught on my own. And I think that you have to be looking a little bit at your shortcomings. You have lots of strengths and whatnot, but there's sometimes you have to rebuild to make your shortcomings a strength. And that knowledge that you have them is a strength. And that goes for the subjects you're researching and the people in the communities you're working with as well.
I would just say, echo what everybody has mentioned, and consider what the reason is for doing the research, and has it been determined by a community as a community asked you to do it? If not, how can you work with the community and recognize that there's unique differences among Indigenous peoples, and really look at some of those ontological assumptions that are constructed within the specific community that you're working with, and that you're being respectful of those viewpoints, as well as the processes that they want to incorporate into the research process. So doing a little bit of homework around an Indigenous research paradigm would be really important before you started, but equally as important is ensuring that the community is involved, in that there's a partnership with a shared vision around what the research goals are.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, everybody.